Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about campaign pacing in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and the kind of issues that Warhammer 3 does have with regards to campaign pacing, and in general strategy games have issues with campaign pacing or game pacing overall. I've played strategy games for almost 30 years at this point. I started when I was 6 years old, give or take. And I got my own computer at 7 years old, my own personal computer. And since then, I've just been playing a lot of strategy games. Warcraft 1, Dune 2, all that kind of stuff. What you usually see in strategy games, or in quite a lot of different games, is that the pacing of those games is broken to a degree or another. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the early game may end up being significantly harder than the late game. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons has to do with just inherent human situation. So when you're starting something new, you're gonna be more reluctant, you're gonna be more careful with the way you're handling it, and you're not necessarily gonna know everything about how to deal with a situation. On top of that, the most limited resources that you always have in virtually every game are the resources that you have early on. So inherently, as you're playing through a game more and more and more, or you're dealing with any kind of situation, the more experienced you are and the more resources you have, the easier it will inherently get. Now, some games do manage to handle this much better than other games. But overall, it is a problem in the way that a lot of games handle their pacing situation in campaigns in particular. But also, again, this is an issue in multiplayer experiences. Now, this has been a problem recognized by a lot of different people in a lot of different games for many years. And while the recognition is correct, the way that you might see a lot of arguments being framed on this particular subject is that a lot of different people will argue that the solution is, let's just make it slower. Let's limit the player resources even further, or let's limit their exponential growth much further than it is. Those kind of things. Those are the kind of arguments I have personally seen for years in many different games across many different genres. It's something mods do, it's something games do. And from my point of view, it almost never works. The reason it doesn't work is because, again, inherently, the more you play the game, the more resources you're going to get regardless of how limited it is, unless a game in particular is just flat out not giving you any kind of resource increase as you're playing through it, and that's its own issue. But on top of that, if you limit resources or you make the AI much stronger, then that is also not really a great solution. Because take for instance this campaign as Tyrion. The best path, if you will, in this campaign would be for me to attack these elements one after another, take them out very quickly, and secure this province in a couple of turns. You could do that, but let's assume, for instance, for the sake of argument, that you can't do that because the AI has too many benefits, too many troops, the challenge is just too great, and you might just not be able to pull it off. Okay, does that incentivize you to play more slowly, more strategically, if you will? Not quite. Instead, what it incentivizes you rather is to engage, is to use every kind of advantage that you do have at your disposal in order to get ahead. So over there, I tried to set up an ambush, it failed. I'm just gonna move my army ahead and try and set up a different ambush right there. Bonus points if I do recruit a couple more units over here on the end turn. If I manage that. May or may not be able to do so. Or I can use, since I've run out of money, I can use a bit of diplomacy, declare war on certain factions, get a bit of money through that, get more troops in order to just keep getting stuff. But even if recruitment was more limited, and the economy was more limited, and the payoff of that economy was more limited. It doesn't fix the problem, it just slows you down, but it's not necessarily making things strategic. It's engaging. It rather quite opposite. It's pushing you down the path of engaging with more and more bullshit. A great example of this in Total War is Shogun 2. So Shogun 2 introduced legendary difficulty in the series. Because if you looked at Empire, if you looked at Napoleon, if you look at Rome 1 and Medieval 2, great games, well, at least Rome 1 and Medieval 2, and to some extent Napoleon, but if you looked at those games, there were many different ways that people could abuse things in order to get ahead. And even back then, what modders did and what players were arguing was, well, we need to slow down the pace of what players can do in order to make things more challenging and strategic. And that's what Creative Assembly did with Legendary Difficulty. They gave the AI substantial cheats, they limited the player in a very significant way, and they tried to prevent the player from snowballing through things like Realm Divide. Did any of those things work? No. None of those things worked in terms of the quote-unquote problem that they were trying to fix, specifically player snowballing, player abusing mechanics. If you're trying to counter someone engaging in an exploit by giving the AI more exploits, then you might succeed in making things more annoying for a player, but that not necessarily slower or more strategic. So what ended up in Shogun 2 is far from the case of like a longer campaign being better in that game or more strategic or anything like that. What ended up is quite the exact opposite, where shorter campaigns were the key to victory. And that continued for a lot of years, like Rome 2, Attila, Warhammer 1, Warhammer 2, and even, yes, Warhammer 3, Realms of Chaos specifically. Because in Shogun 2, the most important battle, the one that actually mattered, was the first one you fought. The shit stain of a battle against like an enemy you would always have in the exact same way, in the exact same situation, that would always play out in a very similar fashion every single time. Because if you won that battle, and then a couple more after that, you would flat out win the campaign. If you lost that battle, you could lose the campaign in 5 turns. Like I'm sure people have played the Wusu game and Oda. If you've tried playing those campaigns on legendary difficulty, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Uesugi experience on legendary was something, because you would have very different factions, horrible provinces to defend, long provinces, you would get raided, your minor, quote-unquote, minor settlements or your economic buildings would get raided, all that kind of stuff. It would end up limiting you quite a bit. But did it succeed in the goal of making longer campaigns work better? Or, quite the contrary to what might be said on the subject, did it just further incentivize an early game aggression? You know the answer to that. It just incentivized early game aggression far more than it did. And that continued for many years. Like Rome 2, Attila continued down the same path. Because, yeah, Shogun 2 is supposedly great. It had its issues, especially in this respect. And then you get mods, like even back in Medieval 2 or Rome 1, that were like of the similar opinion. Like, let's make things slower pace, let's limit the player resources, let's do X, Y, and Z. Because that's going to make it more strategic. Like, I remember when I was playing something like... things like, for instance, I was playing Third Age Total War, and the solution in that game to prevent player snowballing was a garrison script. Oh yes, the infamous garrison script of Third Age Total War. So what would happen is, if you attacked an enemy settlement, especially things like the Black Gate, Minas Tirith, Osgiliath, etc., the AI would just end up getting some very substantial forces to counter you for free. That make things more strategic? Well, it kind of prevented player snowballing to a degree, because there were ways of abusing that and turning that against AI, because you could lure those armies and wipe them out. And, post-battle loot or prisoners could be used for great economic effect in that game. but it wasn't creating a really dynamic of where longer campaigns were better. It just made it so that engaging in a longer campaign was a flat frustrating grind. And it further incentivized players to engage in bullshit tactics. I remember people posting on Total War Centers like, oh, I won this battle with 1,000 elves against 6,000 Uruk-hai. Look at me, how great I am. Because I literally used my archers to kill every single one of them while they couldn't even shoot back. That's the kind of gameplay style that was incentivized for it. And from my view, the issues of campaign pacing come down to the issues of what are the player incentives for success. The quickest path to success with the least resistance. That's always going to matter for any player of any game of any kind of description, right? In that situation, the path of least resistance was abusing things. And again, this continued. In Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, people will mention like, oh, rebellions and control and corruption mattered more, you'd have to invest in a province. But realistically, you didn't. I mean, you would spend more resources dealing with that, sure, but you weren't really slowed down. You were not stopped. And in fact, it was highly beneficial in your campaign situation to use that kind of thing against AI. So what do I mean use that against AI? Well, I mean in the sense that you deliberately get rebellions and then you'd farm those rebellions for experience in a campaign. I mean that you would, for instance, that's one thing you would do. And the worse the corruption, sure, your income might be in a worse state, absolutely. But you would get money from post-battle loot, and crucially, more importantly, you would actually get experience, because the AI would have a lot of experience benefits, would have a lot of experience benefits, economic benefits. You would play a campaign of Warhammer 2, and the AI would be running around with silver ranked units by like turn 20, like a full stack, and then they would get another full stack. So it just incentivized you to abuse things as they were. So abusing ambushes, abusing post-battle loot, abusing rebellions, all those kind of things. Using AI behavior against it. Like, there's a reason why corner camping became so damn popular in that game. It's because like the AI had so many significant cheats that you could either take a long time to do a campaign, which again, it was perfectly doable, but you could grind it out in a long campaign, and that's how my first campaigns of Warhammer 2 were, and Warhammer 1. Though not as long as people might think, actually. Like, I think I finished Warhammer 1 in like 60 turns with Karl Franz Grimgor, and then Warhammer 2 roughly 60, 70, 80 turns, something along those margins, really. And you would take advantage of that situation. You are not incentivized to be more careful. You are not incentivized to hold less territory. Like if an AI faction took, oh, the AI is attacking a shit tier settlement, I can either defeat them and get rewarded, or I can let them take it and get rewarded, because I would then march my main army around there and wipe them out. That's the kind of dynamic we ended up having in that kind of game. Suffice to say, it wasn't a great dynamic. It did not incentivize really strategic play, and incentivized bullshit play. So I don't think that's a good way of handling campaign pacing, and I don't think it's ever been a good way of ever handling campaign pacing in any video game that I've ever personally played. So what's the solution then? Well, I think like if you look at a campaign situation in Warhammer 3 right now, you get campaigns that are more similar to Tyrion. Like, you look at Tyrion's campaign, I think Tyrion's campaign is the poster child of how a campaign shouldn't be in Warhammer 3. And I say shouldn't be, not because he's hard or anything like that. In fact, it's because he's too easy, and he's easy in a bad way. So in Tyrion's campaign, you're incentivized to move very fast. Like, the best way of achieving success is not even ambushing the Druki there. It's actually to march on them as quickly as possible. Wipe them out, take Safri before Alariel can even declare war on them, get all that sweet territory, march north, secure Ulfwan, trying to secure confederations, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, auto-resolve quest battles is probably not enough in that case. Okay, just gonna have to wait a bit longer. But the problem is, regardless of how many times you play this campaign, and regardless of how you play this campaign, due to the high elf race design, you're always going to be limited in the unit roster, in the amount of heroes, in the amount of units you can have, not necessarily in the amount of armies. But the way the High Elves work, they build up over time. So the play their campaign, the stronger they get. Their economy gets stronger, all that. So all that unit variety and hero variety does exist in a High Elven campaign, but it exists much later on in a campaign. So by the time you actually get to that kind of unit variety in any High Elven campaign, not just Tyrion is just the worst example of this, you've long since won the campaign. And then you get the major power spike at the same time as well. You get the major power spike because you do three things simultaneously. One, you get a higher tier settlement, which gives you access to heroes and units. Two, you get higher tier settlements in multiple provinces. Your economy is much stronger. Three, you achieve your short campaign victory condition, which gives you hero capacity. So suddenly you go from maybe having 2 free heroes in a campaign to having 15 plus, something along those lines. You can understand why that's a pretty broken dynamic. And that's the reason why I think High Elves in particular as a race really need a rework, because it is a powerful race. It does get the job done. I don't dispute that. But it's also the race designed in a really bad way. What do I think is a good campaign with a really good campaign pacing? Arbol. Now you might say, well, Arbol is a joke of a campaign. Look, if you're an experienced player, if you're a new player and you're playing on lower difficulty, I can understand why you might think Khorne is a joke. But understand that if I'm playing a Khorne campaign on a higher difficulty especially, you're actively encouraged in a campaign scenario like that. You're actively encouraged, one, to be aggressive early on, to fight a lot of battles, and not necessarily the ones you're most comfortable with. You're not seeking the easiest battles. In fact, you're heavily rewarded in that kind of campaign by defeating powerful opponents. The more powerful opponents, the more buffs you give to the AI, the better off you're going to be in that campaign. So you achieve more in an Arbol campaign if you go head-on against your foes around the world, not just in a little corner of the campaign map, which is the case here. So you can finish the campaign quickly, but most importantly, you will get access to unit variety, hero variety, etc. faster if you do that. But you're having to risk it. You're having to go outside your comfort zone. You're having to seek those foes. You're having to seek those challenges. And I think that fundamentally is why Arbol's campaign in particular is a great campaign. Or you look at Malachi, sure, he has build up and all that, but again, you're encouraged in that kind of campaign situation to go out there, seek foes, and not sit on your ass. Sitting on your ass is never strategic, it's never good. It's just sitting on your ass. And it's just waiting for things to happen, which is a fairly common thing in strategy games, like say for instance you play Command & Conquer campaign or StarCraft campaign or Warcraft campaign. There's many different missions where the incentive structures of those missions is not to go out do stuff or to build a wide variety of units necessarily. It's to build the best unit that's most economically viable and then hurry up and wait in a mission for your resource to be gathered. Then you build a massive army, you achieve success. And StarCraft 2 is one of the very few games, I think, that actually does manage to make the campaign interesting for how not just have an early game situation that's most difficult when you're least experienced. Because in StarCraft 2, Blizzard did put a lot of effort in individual missions, especially Wings of Liberty and Legacy of the Void, to make sure they remain interesting throughout and they're appropriate in scale in terms of challenge. People will always argue that they're too easy, but I mean, there come a point where you're a much better player than the game is designed for, and I don't think games should ever be designed for people. Like, if you're a highly experienced player that knows every single detail about the game, yeah, the game should be a freaking cakewalk for you. That's something else worth pointing out. If you know what the heck you're doing, it should be easy. I don't think that's a discussion. Like, Total War Warhammer 3 has been out for several years. It's been in this kind of situation, in a campaign situation. And I think for what it is worth, that is actually quite very interesting, given that. I'm just going to try and be careful with Noctilus, because he can get a pretty good... Like, I'd probably be able to defeat him, but I'm literally trying to just, like, avoid having to fight battles over here. Though, this is not really the best path of success. If you want to look at a game that I believe does campaign pacing extremely well, you can, or just single-player pacing very well, you can look at Elden Ring. Now, one would argue, like, well, you can beat Elden Ring in 15 minutes, or 4 minutes, or an hour, let's say. We're not glitching the train. Yes, you can. But the question is, does the game incentivize you to do that? Is that the best, easiest path to success? No, it's actually the hardest path to success, because you need to know ins and out of every single enemy, boss. You need to know every detail. You can do it pretty fast if you know what you're doing, and not make it exceptionally painful, because you can take advantage of certain things, get some really powerful items. Even then, the Elden Beast can be a bit tricky, but you can go down that path and beat the game quickly. Absolutely. You can certainly beat that game quickly, but the incentive structure is not like, oh, just Zerg rush your opponent, and then everything becomes easier. It becomes easier once you possess a lot of knowledge surrounding a game. It becomes easier when you know, okay, which items were worth picking up for your specific build. And it becomes easier when you know the builds that you're supposed to use in a kind of campaign situation. That's when it becomes easier. Not just because you can do it in 4 minutes by abusing certain terrain glitches. And it's, mind you, beating that game in 4 minutes or in an hour or anything like that is not freaking easy either. It's actually one of the hardest ways to beat that game, because you're at your weakest point. And you're not really rewarded either for beating it fast. Well, you get money and, you know, experience and all that kind of stuff in that situation, but you're not especially rewarded just because you beat the Elden Beast fast. You'll get a lot of money and some powerful items, but there's better ways to actually farm experience, and much easier paths than going up against some of those bosses as well. So that's worth saying. So I think Creative Assembly is moving in the right direction with regards to campaign pacing, where they're designing campaigns like Arbol and Maneater, which are far more dynamic campaigns, which have a greater variety, and the incentive structure is to go out there and do shit, as opposed to sitting on your ass waiting for things to happen to you. So it's a more active rather than reactive playstyle. But there's a lot of different campaigns in this game to this day that are very, reactive. Like over here, it's obviously highly beneficial for me to be reactive in this kind of situation, wait for Noctilus to show up in this kind of situation, set up an ambush for him, and then just, wait for my economy to build up, get access to research. I'll gain a lot of power for this. Absolutely. The only mod, by the way, if you're wondering, like, just for the sake of argument, this is Legendary very hard. The only mods that I'm using that have any relevance here is like an auto-resolve quest battle mod and a mod that removes sieges from the game, because fuck sieges. Not that I've actually fought a battle where I didn't have siege attacker, right? Because like Tyrion obviously as a legendary lord has siege attacker. That's also another thing. People think that because if you prevent the player from taking settlements in one turn through some bullshit like that, like, oh, let's remove siege attacker, let's make it so the player has to wait turns. Let me just tell you, waiting for shit to happen is never at any point inherently more challenging than just it happening naturally. Any point in any game that I've ever played, you're also, again, you're incentivized to take advantage of region trading, to take advantage of post-battle loot, to take advantage of ambush tactics, to take advantage of quest battles. And look, people will say, oh, but that's explained. At what point? At what point? How many game mechanics? How many things do we have to flat out ignore in a game in order for things to not be considered an exploit? Like, how many mechanics in a campaign do we have to flat out ignore? Region trading is a mechanic. Diplomacy is a mechanic. Ambush is a mechanic. Post-battle loot is a mechanic. How many mechanics do you have to ignore to do this? Like, if you want to do a roleplay campaign, that's perfectly fine. I play Fashion Souls myself in something like Dark Souls. I know it's not the most optimal. That's fine. I'm not telling anyone how they should play their games. But what I dislike in this modern day and age is like people think that the way they want the game to be is the best possible way, or they would prefer to play a game. What's also worse about everything that I described about campaign pacing, the worst aspect about it, it's not even beyond the many issues it creates in terms of like campaign experiences and all that kind of stuff. It's not even teaching players to be better. Like, that's kind of the worst aspect about it. It's actually teaching players to be bad, either sitting on their asses waiting for things to happen, and that's my big issue with something like SFO. It's teaching players to either be bad, be very reactive as opposed to proactive, and that, I think, in general in video gaming is a bad lesson that players should not be taught. And those players are not going to be better for it. They're not going to be good in campaigns. They're not going to be good in individual battles because they've learned the wrong lessons. They might learn that sitting on their ass and waiting for things to happen is the best way to play the game. It's not. Like, in modded on modded, it absolutely is not. Going out there and doing shit is the best way of playing the game. Like, I could have achieved, like, for all the campaign success I've achieved so far in this one, I would have actually achieved more campaign success had I been more proactive, and also if I had fought more battles manually, to be sure. But just because but that's kind of the problem, right? With a campaign like Tyrion, or if you look at certain mods, or certain other Total War games. Like, if you're seriously if anyone's going to look at me and tell me like, oh, Rome, no, forget Rome. Attila created a good campaign incentive if you're playing Western Roman Empire just because you had to deal with a bunch of rebellions. Let me tell you about those bunch of rebellions. It created an incentive where the best way to handle that was abusing those rebellions for resources in a campaign, fighting defensive sieges, and just waiting for things to happen, as opposed to going out there and doing things on your own. But that's also a systems issue with something like Attila, bad system design, you name it, in that kind of context. So I think like we need more active campaigns, we need more dynamic campaigns, we need campaigns. The one comparison I'll always go back to is Troy. In one way. It wasn't perfect, and I'm not going to pretend it was. But I think one of the things that Troy did very well, in terms of its campaign pacing, is this. It incentivized you as a player to get resources and spend those resources. You had a lot of different resources. You could get a truckload of money, so much so that you wouldn't necessarily know what the heck to spend it on. That's one of the things Troy did well in that kind of situation, because it pushed the player towards having a lot of different things. That didn't mean you auto won when you got a lot of resources. In fact, you could easily overextend yourself in a kind of campaign like that and push yourself to reaching, let's just say, a bit too far. How so, you might ask? Well, the simple way for me to answer that is like the main campaign objective in that game was to either take Troy or take Mycenae. But of course, if you invaded Troy or Mycenae, you would be dealing with multiple factions at the same time in that kind of campaign that would throw the vast bulk of their forces against you, and you might be on your own. So actually rushing in Troy was not really a wise idea in quite a few ways. It wasn't a wise idea because it would see you overextended. It would see you up against the wall. It would see you dealing with a lot of potentially powerful opponents at the same time. And you could easily lose that. Like, if you could win it, sure, all well and great, power to you. But more often than not, you would end up biting off a lot more than you could chew. There were balance issues. That was the problem with Troy, but it was like, I think the inherent design philosophy there of how a campaign worked was significantly better than what we got in, say, Pharaoh. Pharaoh copied SFO's homework in a way. Like, there was literally an option like, oh, just disable auto-resolved battles because people can abuse them. Having to fight battles manually does not make a campaign more, by the way. And I say this as someone who played a 230-turn campaign in Rome 2 when it came out as Sparta and won every single battle fighting it manually. I never auto-resolved a single battle in that campaign. I still won it. It wasn't the easiest experience, I'm gonna admit, because I had no fucking clue what I was doing on that first time, but I did complete it. It wasn't really the first campaign I tried. Like, I gave it a couple of attempts before I succeeded, but it was the first campaign I finished. And while you might think that was a great experience, it wasn't. It was abuse after abuse after abuse after abuse. It wasn't really a test of my skill. It was like, can I run with these units 30 minutes in a siege battle so that the timer runs out and I win the siege? That was the kind of experience I had there at Sparta. In that kind of campaign. And I conquered the world, by the way. Like, probably because I kept expanding west when my objectives were to go east. That was a smart move. So by the time I decided to move east, I had conquered most of the west. Or I had so many armies that I was like, okay, let's do both. And I did both. So that's my perspective on the issue of campaign pacing and what I think would be better. So less, I guess if you were to use modding terms, less SFO or third age total war and more radius to some extent, but without maybe some of the bloat in that. But maybe when I say something like radius, I mean the intent. More armies, more shit to do, and a better system of handling that. Like, better system of handling multiple heroes in a campaign. Better system of handling multiple armies. Because that's also another issue of campaign pacing. Just the bloat that you get inherently in a campaign when you're playing a longer one. And how horrible the management can feel in that kind of longer campaign is not really favorable in its own right for longer campaigns right now in Total War. There's some mods that do fix it somewhat, yes, but it's not really a perfect design from that perspective, you know, just item management, hero management, and all that kind of stuff. Like, you know, you look at upgrading items. It's great we got that option, but we really do want, like, you know what I would like? I would like a system where I would just select an army, just select a simple army and say, okay, I want these guys to be equipped with the best items I have, all that, and the best ancillaries for, say, Bal or for anything like that, all that kind of stuff. And I think that would be a really great system, better than what we ultimately have right now. That's my perspective on it. Because, like, yeah, just having to go for every hero, put their skills, then worry about until... Oh, and don't even get me started with the freaking banners and unlocking some of those really powerful ones, because they're really worth it, and managing all that, just a waste of damn time. That's another thing to be said. Some people think that just having a lot of buttons to click every single turn is somehow strategic. I don't know where people got that damned impression, because it sure shit is not really strategic in a kind of campaign situation, I gotta tell you. In fact, it's just a tedious waste of time. In a lot of different ways. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Christine here, signing out. Stay tuned for more.